Okay, we should be good.
Okay.
All right, ready to go. Good morning, everybody. This is Tony Lathrop. I want to welcome everybody to the meeting. And as always, thank everybody for your time and engagement. And I want to particularly thank the team, Alan and Laura and Allison and Taiwo and the whole crew for the years and great work they've done and continue to do on this to pull it together. And, you know, and my mantra is that your participation ongoing in this process is absolutely critical to the success of what we're doing. And I think it's already contributed enormously to it. And as I say over and over, without an inclusive and transparent and rigorous process, we just can't get a good result. And so what you all continue to do is build just a strong foundation for this UDO. And, you know, and as you know, it's becoming more and more public, which is a good thing. And the work that we have all done over the years, I think, forms a strong, strong foundation for the more public phase that's starting to be upon us. And in that vein, people are saying, when are we going to get a draft? When are we going to get a draft out in public? And the answer is not yet, but pretty soon. It's coming. You know, we want to make sure we get it right and before it comes out. And so that's what's going on. And you all, Allison and Alan and Laura and your team, you can elaborate on that as you need to. But thank you again, everybody. I'm in the car on my way back from 2 days of NCDOT meetings, Board of Transportation meetings in Raleigh. So I'm taking off that hat here in the car and putting on my UDO hat. So glad to be here and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tony. And as always, thank you for your leadership. We appreciate having you part of this group. So thank you for always being here and just the kind words and encouragement that you provide. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here today. We're starting a 3-part series where we're going through our street subdivision and infrastructure article of the UDO. Lots of important topics to cover here. And so, which is why we split into 3 different meetings, just to make sure that we have time to present some of the ideas that staff has and hear your feedback and have some lively discussion, which I know we always do as this group, and we greatly appreciate that. So thank you all for being here. And yes, as Tony said, we don't have a draft. We hear that quite often, but it's like a term paper. You know, you've got little chunks you're working on, and you know, getting some feedback from your professors and other folks, maybe peers, and making updates, and hope to have that draft out later in the summer, probably late summer, maybe even early fall. As you can see today, we've got a little bit larger group here. This is really a joint presentation between planning and CDOT. And so we've got a bunch of our CDOT staff here with us today. So I believe this is a tag team presentation between our departments. And so again, thank you for your participation. Thank you for being here. And I will turn things over to Alan.
Thanks, Allison. So hopefully everybody can see the slides on the screen. If you can't, just put something in the chat and we'll figure out how to help you see the slides. So today, as mentioned, we're going to be at part 1 of a 3-part series on what we call SSI, subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. And before I turn it over to Kevin May, let's just go over a couple of our housekeeping slides that we usually do. I don't know if we've been successful in live streaming to our YouTube channel. If somebody can confirm that we can see that, but that's our intention. Sometimes we have a little bit of technical difficulty making that happen. But regardless, this meeting is being recorded and will be available on the Charlotte UDO website, as well as on our planning department's YouTube channel. And our procedures will follow what we've been doing for the past several meetings. Staff will go through the slides and narrate. As we go through them, if you wish to make comments or ask questions in the chat box, please do that. We'll stop at least once in the middle of the presentation, and then again at the end, if not more frequently, to open up the microphones and just try to address questions and receive comments in that manner as well, so that hopefully by the end of this presentation, we will have addressed and answered all comments and questions that we're able to do. So I think with that, unless there are any questions, and I've gotten confirmation that we are currently live on YouTube, so that's good news. Thanks, Lorena. Let me now turn it over to Kevin May.
Hey, thanks. Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. And good early or good late morning or good early afternoon, everybody. Some of you may recognize me, some of you may not. If you do, you probably know that it's been quite a while since I was last in front of you all talking about a topic, and that last time was with signs, but I know we've got some newer members who may not have seen me before. So I am Kevin May. I am part of the UDO team, and I am really the task lead for our efforts compiling a subdivision streets and infrastructure article. And before we get started really with the meat of our meeting and talking through this slide, I just wanted to kind of set expectations for today's meeting. And I'm going to do that by saying that today's meeting is really very high level and foundational setting. We've got some folks on our OAC who, through their experience and what they do, are very well versed in development here in the city and or our subdivision ordinance. And then we've got some folks that aren't. You know, there may be some of our newer members who are contributing a neighborhood perspective that don't really have a lot of familiarity with our development environment or our subdivision ordinance. And so really, as we get ready to engage in the upcoming sessions with regard to subdivision, streets, and infrastructure, we thought it was very important to start at a very high level and set kind of a foundational basis so that as we go forward, that everybody's able to really go through the substantive review pieces, looking at it with as about as equal comparable lens as possible. So for those of you that are well versed and have familiarity with the subdivision ordinance, this might feel a little bit basic. And for those of you who don't really have a lot of experience, we hope that this will give you the insight that you need as we go forward to review some of the more substantive pieces going forward. So kind of with that setting, we'll go ahead and talk through this first slide. And really, I wanted to start and touch base on what is SSI? What are we talking about when we say that? And really what we're talking about is we're talking about subdivisions, streets, and infrastructure. And with subdivisions particularly, often you'll find that a lot of the things that subdivision might put their lens and perspective on is projects that are subject to what we call subject to the subdivision regulations. And you can think of these as projects that might require new streets or, say, a traditional greenfield development. And then there are also projects that might go through subdivision review that we call not subject to. And quite often, you could think of these as things that may be infill development, where maybe they're taking a larger R3 and perhaps making it split itself, or there's a series of exemptions. Or the other thing I'll say is oftentimes there'll be just a property that moves its lines and things like that. We kind of consider to be not subject to. And then we also talk about streets, and with streets, you could think of that as things like the street network and block design, or curb and gutter, amenity zone and planning strip, the sidewalk shared use path, and off-street public path. And then with infrastructure, I think it's important to know that a lot of the things that we talk about as we go forward, many of them can be considered infrastructure, and it is those pieces. But also, we want to point out that infrastructure is also drainage, water supply, and wastewater sewer. And so we recognize again that a lot of it is infrastructure, but it's not just these pieces here. We're looking at it through a larger lens. Next slide, please. So as we go forward, some of the high-level concepts and goals that we're trying to achieve as we go through our development of an SSI article is, as always, ensure alignment with policy. We want to recognize and address trends, and I guess I would say the best way to explain that is, the subdivision ordinance, I think, was absent the 160D text amendment here recently, I think passed or updated in 2015. And if I'm not correct on that, Josh or somebody can correct me. But that seems like it wasn't that long ago, but it was 6 years. And we all know that development can change pretty rapidly. And so even though 6 years was probably pretty recently, the development world can change pretty frequently and fast as well. And so we want to recognize where we currently are at, and then maybe also try to extrapolate out for some trends that may be coming as well. And then also just a larger theme of the Unified Development Ordinance. We always want to create a better and more user-friendly structure. And then again, as part of that larger umbrella effort, providing consistency and uniformity. Again, really putting the unified in the Unified Development Ordinance. And then we've heard this feedback, especially recently here through our last series of meetings. And that's really trying to, as part of this effort, identifying and leverage trigger alignment possibilities when it's feasible. It may not always feasible to have alignment in those triggers, but where we can, we're going to aim to achieve that. Next slide. Again, some more of the high-level concepts and goals. Again, collating, updating, and simplifying our standards. We recognize that some of our standards need to be updated just by the nature of the recent reorganization of the land use regulation framework at the state level with Chapter 160D. And then similar, if any of you were with us during the signs text amendment a couple years ago, you recognize that at that point, sign regulations were scattered all over the place throughout the zoning ordinance. And it's a little bit similar with the subdivision and SSI standards. They're kind of scattered all over the place. And it could be really confusing if you're trying to develop per those standards. They're scattered in city code. Obviously, you've got the standalone subdivision ordinance, but there are pieces that speak to SSI standards in the zoning ordinance as well. There are separate, sometimes small area plans like the Plaza Central Pedscape plan that have certain requirements for streetscape standards and treatments. And then somebody mentioned we've got our CDOT partners on here. And so we've got this the CDOT driveway manual also that can speak to some SSI standards and regulations. And so this is just but a sampling. I'm sure there are other areas where SSI standards are that aren't specifically called out here. But again, you can see how, if you're really trying to develop in this world, it could be quite a few places you have to reference and or it could be confusing to somebody trying to develop. Next slide. And so this should be a pretty familiar slide to all of us by now. It's almost with us at every OAC meeting. And this is just really, again, showing the connection between our comp plan efforts and our UDO efforts. This, the comp plan continues to be, and it will now and forward, be our North Star with regard to what we're trying to do with these implementation pieces. And what you'll see coming up on the next slide, please, is we've got a sampling of the policy references that are currently in the current draft of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan that kind of call out some of the goals or policies or objectives that we keep in mind as we go forward in trying to develop some of the standards for subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. Next slide. So I want to paint a little bit of a picture for the rest of today's meeting, as well as looking forward a little bit. And I've titled this slide, The Road Ahead. And yes, that is very much a pun intended, interjecting a little humor into our meeting. And today, what we're really aiming to do is kind of give you, as I said at the outset, an introduction and some policy context with regard to our efforts in developing subdivision, streets, and infrastructure concepts. You're going to hear a little bit about where we've been and where we're going, especially with regard to kind of our street networks. We're hoping this is going to serve as a primer for you guys on common themes and terminology that will be weaved through some of the other pieces that we continue to see as we go forward into the next 2 sessions. And then we're going to talk through some concepts for 2 of our articles, that being the concepts for our introduction article, as well as some concepts for our subdivision article. Following today, we'll have a second engagement coming up in 2 weeks on June 24th, where we will get into a little bit more of a substantive review of some of our SSI concepts. And then our third engagement will be 2 weeks after that on July 8th. Now, before we go on, I wanted to say that there are things today that may not have necessarily been called out when I talked about what is SSI, and those things are like CATs or transit pieces or off-street public paths or even other infrastructure. And that's not because we're putting them to the side. It's just that we're not going to dive deep into those topics today, but in the coming sessions, you'll hear more about pieces like that. Next slide, please. And so with that, I will graciously turn it over to Tracy Newsom, who is with the Charlotte Department of Transportation. That unit and her team have been integral in helping me craft the concepts around the subdivision streets and infrastructure concepts. And I think she's going to, again, set a little bit of context and provide a little bit of a lens of where we've been and where we're going. So, Tracy.
Thanks, Kevin. First off, can everybody hear me? Okay, good. As Kevin said, we really want to take a little bit of a step back and go to some basics today to make sure everybody's kind of on the same stage, has the same contextual background as we go through the more substantive content over the next few weeks. And to do that, we'll take a little brief dip into history here. So Kevin's already talked about one reason for doing the UDO and for updating the regulations is to provide, more user-friendly approach, everything in one place. Another reason is to make sure that we're, reflecting what we need to do from a policy standpoint in our regulatory environment. So just a brief dip back into history here, and this means going back a century and basically saying that, in the first half of the last century, we built our street network in a way that actually turned out to be fairly resilient. We built a very connected grid. Our streetcar era suburbs, you can still see that today. Connected streets, relatively short blocks, mostly tree lined, usually with sidewalks. And so that was really the way we built our streets for the first probably 4 to 5 decades of the last century. Alan, could you advance, please? That changed after World War II. And I want to point out, this says Charlotte's streets post-World War II. We're not picking on Charlotte. This is a very common way that land and street network developed after World War II, particularly in cities that saw most of their growth during that era. So when you look across Charlotte's landscape, there are places that don't look like the street network, for example, in the Northeast or the older Midwest cities that saw most of their growth prior to World War II. So what we saw after World War II was a much less connected network, the proliferation of a cul-de-sac style development, longer streets, longer blocks. And what that meant then is that rather than having the network to disperse traffic, a lot of the traffic was put onto the thoroughfares or the arterials. But we also had built a more sparse arterial network. So as a result, those arterials tended to hold and have to handle a lot more traffic. What that did then is make it also harder to walk along and across those arterials. So basically, we became very, very auto-oriented in terms of our network and in terms of our design of our streets during that latter half of the last century. Advance, please. So things began to change really towards the end of the last century. When we started to back up, please. Thank you. Things began to change towards the end of the last century. We started to see For example, our regulatory world changed a little bit, started to, I think in the late 80s, have sidewalks built on one side of the street. By the end of the 90s, we were building sidewalks on both sides of the street and beginning to try to a little bit limit the use of cul-de-sacs because of their disconnected tendencies. And so what we've seen over the course of the first 20 years of this century is really an attempt to advance those policies to basically realize that strictly auto orientation in our street network and our street design really isn't going to be sustainable for continued development. We've got to find other ways to grow our network and to have people be able to get around. So the 21st century thus far has been kind of an ongoing and an evolving commitment to complete streets that serve all users better, a more complete network, a more connected network, a more multimodal network so that people can still be able to get around by cars, but also can walk, bike, use transit more easily. So now could you advance, please? So this is, as I said, it's been kind of a gradual, continual path towards that approach for complete streets and multimodal network. In the middle of the 2000s, the Urban Street Design Guidelines and Transportation Action Plan, the first Transportation Action Plan, were adopted, which were basically the commitment to complete streets and the programs and the designs to do that. In 2016 and 2017, the work was done on our first pedestrian program, the Charlotte Walks Plan, which advanced those pedestrian-related aspects of the network. Charlotte Bikes was adopted by council in 2017, which basically it did a lot of things in terms of setting out what we want to do in terms of our bike infrastructure, but it really modernized our design guidance and our approach and our recommended bike facilities as well. So this has been a steady path in a direction towards a more multimodal network, a more sustainable network. And this is really culminating now. Could you advance, please? Culminating in the policies of the 2040 plan. Kevin pointed out some of those policies, and as we go through the next few weeks and look at specific elements of SSI, you'll see that there's really, from a policy standpoint, it's more a commitment, a continuation of the same policies that now we have been in place for some time, basically to overcome having built a certain way for 50 years and now trying to make sure that we're building in a way that is more sustainable, more multimodal. Can you advance, please? So as Kevin said, we're going to be pretty basic today because we want to make sure everybody's kind of using the same term or familiar with the terms. And so we get asked a question of, what is a street, since this is a street subdivision and infrastructure chapter. And really there's two ways to look at this question. There's the basic question of what is a street? And then there's the more specific question of what is a street in terms of the UDO and in terms of how it's handled in the UDO. So that first basic question of what is a street, if you think about how a street feels and how it functions and how people use it, it really is that kind of building front to building front, that entire space between the buildings. From a UDO perspective, though, those of you who have been in this group and have kind of gone through the zoning work so far, we know that things that are handled on site and for the buildings and the frontages of the buildings are handled in the zoning portion of the UDO. Advance, please. There's also that space between the building front and the sidewalk, and we call that the semi-public realm. That could be a yard in a single family type of development, or it might be on-street dining or some other sort of use in a more urban environment. That also is handled through zoning. So the regulations related to that are in the zoning portion of the UDO. Advance, please. So that leaves basically from the UDO perspective and the SSI chapter, the street is that portion of the street that is between the back, basically from sidewalk to sidewalk. And so what that means is those components of the street includes, what's happening in terms of center space. Is there a median? Are there turn lanes? Are there pedestrian refuge opportunities? in the center of the street. It's the travel lanes, the lanes that are used to move transit and motor vehicles, and in some cases, bicycles as well. We'll look closer at that. It is basically, it might be within the curbs. It might include a bicycle facility. A bicycle facility may be behind the curb. It includes space for trees as a buffer, in a buffer space between the pedestrian environment and the motor vehicle environment. And then it includes the pedestrian space as well, the sidewalk, or in some cases, a shared use path where the pedestrians and the bicyclists share that space. And so really, those are the components of the street that, you know, when we're talking about SSI and we're talking about the types of policies that are embedded in the regulations, those are the parts of the streets we're talking about. So advance, please. So another basic topic that, you know, if you've been in this group all along, you're familiar that we've used these terms in bold in other parts of the UDO: limited access, arterials, collectors, and locals. Now, this says street classifications, and I think you could argue that limited access, which basically includes freeways and interstates, those aren't really streets, they're more roads or roadways. But we're just, for the sake of discussion here, we'll leave them in this list as a street classification. And so basically, we've got limited access roadways. We have arterials. Sometimes people use the term thoroughfare. We're using the term arterial. And we have different types of arterials. And we're going to basically look a little bit closer at each one of those. And then we have collector and local streets as well. And so when we talk about the characteristics of this street, there are a lot of different ways that you can say, well, what is this street like compared to a different kind of street? And so if you could advance one, please. One of the first types of characteristics that we can look at to kind of differentiate between these streets, and I should say that really all of these streets are kind of on a continuum. It's a spectrum in terms of each of these characteristics and where they might fall along it. It's maybe not exactly linear. We can talk, for example, about whether the type of access that is available on a main street. But generally speaking, what we're saying is that the higher you are on the list on the left there, the limited access by its very name says it's a very limited access. Your ability to get access onto specific sites is very limited. There's not going to be many driveways. They're not going to be side streets. And so as you move down the spectrum or along the spectrum, it shouldn't be down, just along that spectrum, you get down to streets like, you know, avenues and collectors and local streets where you might have much more direct access. And in fact, local streets are themselves to gain direct access onto properties. And so you're going to have more driveways, for example, more ways to gain access. Next, please. Speed is another characteristic that's important to understand in terms of not only, you know, what the design expectations are, but how the street is used as well. So limited access roadways obviously are high-speed roadways and are basically focusing on throughput, higher volumes. In fact, you can go ahead and advance to the next characteristic. Volumes and speeds often work together to say, you know, what is the throughput nature of these streets? And so limited access roadways clearly are high volume, high speed roadways. Arterials kind of move their way down along that spectrum to lower speed, in some cases, lower volumes, not always. And then when you get down to the main streets and the collectors and the locals, you have very low speed, very low volume type roadways. Next, please. And then from the standpoint, and again, this goes back to kind of the historical perspective and the policy perspective that we were talking about, you can also look at these streets from the standpoint of how multimodal are they. And so along this spectrum at the one end, you have very auto-oriented streets like the limited access roadways, the interstates and freeways. And then you have very pedestrian-oriented streets like main streets and some, in particular, local streets, some types of local streets. And I think it's important to note that, you know, all of the streets on the roadways on the left side of this slide fall somewhere along this spectrum. When we talk about multimodal streets, if you could go to the next slide, please. we can apply the same concepts and characteristics to those arterial streets. And so when we talk about the street classifications for arterial streets, we can use the same way of looking at the characteristics. A parkway is a much more managed street in terms of access. It is a higher speed, higher volume street. It is very auto-oriented. As you move your way through boulevards and avenues and certainly down to main streets, you work towards a lower speed, lower volume in many cases, not in all cases, and then a much more multimodal, a more balance among the modes and more pedestrian-oriented street as well. And so that's kind of a summary of the characteristics that can be used to define the street classifications. I think it might help to look, we thought it might help to look a little closer at some characteristics of each of these arterial street types. So could you, or actually of all the streets, could you advance, please? All right, examples of limited access roadways I think are pretty obvious. They're roadways like I-77, I-277, I-85, the interstates. It's also other forms of limited access roadways like freeways and expressways. Independence Boulevard would be one, would fall into this category. Now this photo, there's still driveways and access. There's probably more access than we would be looking at in the future along this type of roadway. Next, please. So in terms of the arterials, the Parkway is really very similar to other types of limited access roadways. We're calling it an arterial street. There are certain design elements that we would want to include, even though it is a limited access street, if at all possible. But it shares a lot of characteristics of limited access streets. You're not going to have a lot of driveways along it. You're not going to have, you may have side streets on some of them, but you're not going to have many of them. You're going to have a wide, hopefully a wide, median, continuous median to limit access and to limit turns. You're going to have a lot of space. You might have 4, 6, maybe even in some cases 8 lanes, but you're also going to have a lot of space, green space to the edges of the roadway itself, including a clear zone for safety because of the higher speed, higher volume nature of the street. If there is a multimodal facility associated with a parkway, it's going to be a shared use path, and it's going to be at the very back of the right of way or maybe outside of the right of way. But that's, like I said, this really shares a lot of characteristics with the limited access. Next, please. A boulevard at this point becomes really more of a surface street, more of a traditional thoroughfare type street. It is a little higher on the spectrum in terms of speeds than an avenue and certainly than a main street, but it's still not intended to be a high speed street. It could be anywhere from 4 to 6 lanes. It is more access managed than some of the other arterial street types. So you're more likely in terms of the center space to see a continuous median, to have some limits on turning ability, some limits on direct access onto land uses along it. It is, however, expected to try to at least attempt to serve a multimodal purpose. And in some contexts, that's going to be a lot easier than others, but it is expected to provide for bikes and pedestrians. And in some cases, that could be a bike facility between the curbs in many cases, if the context allows it, particularly since there's less access across the shared use path, that might be a shared use path. So boulevard can be applied in a fairly urban context. It can be applied in a more suburban context, but it typically is going to have more access limitations. And so some examples of this would be, if you think of like Tyvola Road in the Marion Deal portion of that, or carrying the same corridor through Fairview out by Carmel, you can see this kind of possible approach. Is it a perfect boulevard? Does it have all the pieces? Maybe not, but to just give you an idea of the type of street we're talking about. Next, please. The avenue is probably the arterial street type that really we're trying to balance this multimodal aspect as much as possible. Here, Access might still, in some circumstances, be a little bit limited, but it opens up certainly compared to a boulevard. So it's a little less access managed. It is the center space, as a result, the center space might be very different. It might be turn lanes, space for turn lanes. It might be portions of a continuous median. It might be space that's used to create pedestrian refuge opportunities where there might be long distances between signalized crossings, and so that people can get across the street. It can work in a very urban environment. It can also work in a suburban environment. You're going to have travel lanes. They're going to be anywhere from 2 to, you could have 6. Many of them are going to be in the 2 to 4 lane in terms of through travel lanes. And I think an important point is the speeds will be low. The volumes are expected to be lower than a boulevard, but in some cases they're not, because don't forget, we still have a sparse thoroughfare network. We still have a sparse arterial network. And so that means we still can have some high volumes on a lot of these avenues. The point is we're trying to handle that volume a little bit differently. So an avenue, you're more likely also to have some sort of a protected in-street bike facility rather than a shared use path. You're still going to have, on all of these street types, there's going to be space provided for street trees. On a boulevard, that's almost always going to be a planting strip type treatment. On an avenue, it's mostly going to be a planting strip with trees, but it might in some cases be a hardscaped amenity zone, but always we want to have the space there for the trees and the buffer between the sidewalk and the actual travel lanes. And so again, the sidewalks are going to be included on avenues, and those widths might vary depending on the context. So the avenue is very context-based in terms of its potential design. There are many avenues across the city. If you want examples, some of them are designed similar to this, and many of them are not at this point. But avenues, the types of streets we're talking about are things like maybe East Boulevard, Central Avenue, Beatty's Ford Road and the closer in portions, for example, Old Pineville Road. Next, please. So Main Street Arterial is the most pedestrian oriented street in our lexicon. And so it is, it's going to be 2 lanes. It's going to be very low speed, low volume. It typically, because it is so low speed and low volume, typically the bicycle space is going to be shared. They're going to have shared lanes. There's going to be on-street parking. There'll still be space for street trees. Typically, not in all cases, but typically that space might lean towards the hardscaped amenity zone. But there's still going to be the space for the trees and the trees, hopefully. The Main Street has the widest sidewalk as well at 10 feet to accommodate the fact that it is really designed building front to be very, very pedestrian oriented and to support that type of environment. The buildings are going to be pretty much right at the back of the sidewalk as well. So this is a special street, and in the sense that it is probably less multimodal than it is very pedestrian oriented, but it should function for all modes as well. So you might be asking at this point, okay, how do we know, that's just great, we've got these different kinds of arterials, how do we know which one is which? If you could advance, please. There will be a map that will say which of the arterials is which. So this is something that we're currently using for the transit-oriented development districts along the blue line. There's a map that says not only what is the classification of the street, but what is that expected cross-section for the street and where does the future curb line go, so that we can create, kind of clarity and predictability about the changes as they occur along the street. And so what will happen is that we'll expand this streets map citywide to include basically the entire city, not just the blue line. And it will function in much the same way. And again, this is not going to be very different from how it's being used for TOD now. Next, please. So the arterial streets will be on the streets map. Actually, the limited access will also show on the streets map as well, but without cross sections, and we'll get into all of that down the road. No pun intended. So the local streets are not on the streets map. There are several types of local streets that are basically scaled to the context in which they're used. They're applied in different contexts. Their cross sections, while the arterial cross sections will be on the streets map, the cross sections for these local streets will be in the Land Development Standards Manual. And that is pretty much that's the way it works now as well. So there are residential streets, there are office commercial streets, and there are industrial streets, and they are applied in those appropriate contexts. Next, please. So collector streets, if you remember the spectrum arrow, it actually fell between arterials and locals. It really serves a hybrid function in the network. It is, from a design perspective, collector streets are fairly similar to local streets. The volumes are going to fall between the arterial and the local street volumes. The speeds will be low like local streets, and they really serve to create a connection either to or between arterials. And if you think about it, they connect to arterials in cases where there's a very disconnected network. They connect between arterials where the network is perhaps a little better connected. So they serve a very important function, but they're kind of a hybrid type of street. With that, that's kind of a description of all of the different street types to try to get everybody kind of on the same page when we use these terms of kind of what we're talking about. So next, please. Kevin?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, and thank you to everybody in Team CDOT as well. And we're going to go ahead and pause here briefly. I know we've just digested a lot of information and a lot of slides. We're going to go ahead and try to play catch up a little bit on some of the questions and comments that we see flying fast and heavy in the chat box, and also maybe some of the questions if you've got them and you don't want to unmute yourself. But first, I'd like to say, so we have already seen, and one of the things we love about these engagements is that we're receiving a lot of questions and comments in the chat box, and I would encourage you to continue to do that through the rest of our meeting. I do want to take this opportunity to introduce a couple of other members of Team CDOT that you may not know by face or name, but are kind of busy monitoring the chat box. And the one is Julian Burton, and then the other is Felix Obregon. Both of them are work with Tracy and are kind of Team CDOT. And so as you see the kind of dialogue in the chat box, if you see Felix or Julian jumping in on some answers, you'll know that they're speaking from a CDOT perspective. I was trying to follow along the best I could through the dialogue in the chat box. I want to say I think everybody's question or comment had been addressed, save for, I think Nate kind of had a two-part question, and I'm not sure that we addressed the second part. I think, Laura, you've addressed the part about the bike map with Nate. Thank you. And again, continuing to fly fast and heavy. I think everybody's comment has been addressed, though I would invite John, Dick, Eric, Warren, Kyle, if there's any follow-up that you want to have on any of the questions that you've asked, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we can discuss that. And then anybody else that may have a question, if you'd also like to raise your hand, we can get you unmuted and we can have a little bit of discussion. Eric, I see you've got your hand raised. Why don't you go ahead and come off mute there and ask away, sir.
Sure. So two parts, I guess. One is from what Felix did mention about looking into the broadening the classifications. And then the second part is, recognizing that some of the classifications are auto-centric, when you're talking about collectors and arterials, they're all focused around, getting cars out of their residential to these bigger roads, which lead to the interstates. And, it's kind of older classifications. Obviously, they've been adapted for multimodal, but, other cities have been breaking those out and looking at them a little bit differently so they can focus, these really transit oriented streets and multimodal streets, or maybe say pulling out industrial streets, you know, that are just where industrial parks are. They're going to look completely different from, you know, those multimodal areas. And is it worth and is it appropriate to do this now? I know we're doing so much other, but I feel like at some point that we need to kind of take a look at all of that to see if we can get a better classification system.
Thanks for that, Eric. Felix, Julian, do you have any seasoning you'd like to put on Eric's question?
So I could respond briefly, and Eric, I know we've talked about this, and we can continue to follow up with that and kind of go into a little bit more detail on that. But you know, as we think of collectors, you're right, that terminology comes from a very specific use of the collector. But maybe it helps better to think of them, and I think this is consistent with how we look at it from a network perspective. Think of them more as connectors and less as collectors. They have had to serve that function because of the way that our network developed. And so your point's taken on that. I think that one of the things that we want to be careful of in terms of thinking about the classifications that we're using is that they don't preclude identifying streets that would be more transit oriented, for example. So there's not something that precludes the ability to say that here's the design that's going to be for this particular street because it has a high incidence of transit. So all of that would be rolled in. It doesn't necessarily address changing the names of the streets, but it's certainly, there's nothing in the classification that precludes the types of things that you're talking about.
And I guess, Tracy, just to follow up with that, and I asked everybody in chat, especially the folks who are doing development, would that be useful to have that clarification? So you know when you're doing a project, is that classification of street going to include more transit wrapped up in that map? You know what I'm saying? Otherwise, they may have to go to another source or figure out, you know, what does that connect to? Is that going to be a multimodal, or is this a completely different thing? I was just wondering, it's nice having a simple, and that's a benefit, but then versus, you know, okay, if I'm doing this project, it's on this, would it be helpful to know that it's something else right there without having to go hunt for it?
Yeah, just quickly to follow up, Eric, you know, CATS is engaged in an effort to identify transit priority streets, and the streets map and the work that we would do in relation to kind of what we would say about a given street will be reflective of that as well. So that's intended to be it's not developed in a silo. We'll talk more about that when we get into the details in the coming sessions. But it is not intended to be a siloed type process or a siloed product.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you as well, Eric, for the discussion. Kyle, I see you've got your hand raised. I will get to you in just a second. There are a couple of questions that had popped up in the chat box, and really in reading through Dave and Marjorie's questions, they each of them look like probably Josh, you could probably shed some insight on if you wouldn't mind unmuting and maybe taking a look at Dave and Marjorie's questions.
So Dave, number one, the UDO is a conglomeration of all of the city ordinances, and when the ETJ it was adopted by the city, our ordinances became applicable in the ETJ. So yes, so along with that, city staff work very closely with NCDOT to make sure that the street cross sections we're approving in the ETJ are roads that could be accepted by the state, because the city can't annex right now. So for the most part, yes. If there's a portion of the street that NCDOT has a different standard for or a higher standard for, then we would defer to NCDOT to make sure that those streets are able to be maintained by the state for maintenance. And your third question, for the most part, yes, we've aligned our street cross sections with NCDOT, and we work directly with them to make sure the streets are able to be accepted when the developer gets to that place that they're turning them over to for maintenance. Hope that helps.
Great, Josh. And I appreciate you jumping on Dave's question. I think I know the answer to Marjorie's question, but
yeah,
I'll defer to you.
County addressing is responsible for house numbering.
All right. I appreciate that, Josh. And Marjorie, if you had additional follow-up that you needed clarification on that caused you to ask specifically about that, feel free to reach out to us and we'll see if we can't source some additional information or a better answer for you. Kyle, you have your hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and lower your hand and ask that you unmute and feel free to contribute. Kyle, did I lose you? I'm not hearing you. Okay, Kyle, you're either still muted or you've stepped away. Feel free again to raise your hand if you catch back up with us. Warren, I see now that your hand is raised. I'm going to go ahead and lower it and ask that you contribute.
Alrighty, thank you. I wanted to follow up with the answer to Dave's third question because that triggered a memory from some years ago that I figured it'd be quicker to ask than do the research. I have this recollection that some years ago, the Division 10 NCDOT engineer sent out a letter saying that the department was not going to take on maintenance responsibilities for subdivision streets in the future. Am I remembering that correctly? Or is that actually the case? So that that if a subdivision is built in a county area outside of a city's jurisdiction, NCDOT's Division 10 is not doing any maintenance?
Warren, I'm not familiar with that letter. We've been working directly with Wendy with NCDOT, and her staff reviews all new subdivisions in the ETJ to make sure that they meet the standards so they could be accepted. But if there was that letter, I'm sorry, I don't know about it.
Okay.
I'll do a little more looking and then maybe put a reference in the chat box.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Josh. Kyle, I think you did get booted, but I think I see that you've joined us now again. Did you want to unmute and contribute?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just wondering, Felix had answered a couple of the questions relating to that the street map is a continually living document and it can be continually reevaluated. My question here is, is this a silo perspective or is the reevaluation procedure planned to be put into the UDO? And is it easily accessible to community members? Because in my experience, trying to work on different street issues in my neighborhood, it's been a very, very difficult procedure to advocate for a street redesignation.
Sure. Thanks for that question, Kyle. Felix, Julian?
I can give a little feedback on that. We are currently looking at what an amendment process would be for the streets map, and that's something that's going to be located in a separate document, likely the streets manual. It's going to be referenced within the UDO, but it's going to be a process that's going to be laid out within the streets manual. And so that's still something that we are working on, but we do realize there needs to be some kind of an amendment process built into the streets map.
Great. Thanks, Julian. Nate, I think I had you next. You've got your hand up. Feel free to unmute and contribute.
So Shannon and Josh, I'm going to ask my favorite question. Are we going to figure out with Charlotte Water the whole private utilities and public streets thing in the UDO?
I guess I'll say, Nate, we're going to need your help. And it's not an easy nut to crack, and we're going to have to keep trying.
All right. For everyone's, to explain it, we build all these public streets through communities that it's one community and there's a variety of public streets. Well, you have to treat them like individual developments from a utility standpoint, which is very expensive and does not make any sense. And we've been talking about this for probably 10 years. So maybe the UDO will get us there. We'll see. I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Josh. Walter, you have your hand up. Feel free to contribute.
Thanks, Kevin. This offers me an opportunity to go back to a conversation we were having at the last meeting about ETJs and the difference in development requirements for streets and ETJs. So Laura, how timely that this would come up today. Warren, I think the issue that you were raising a while ago, as I recall, was not so much that they were not going to maintain them. NCDOT was not going to maintain these subdivision streets, but that they would only maintain them if they met state street requirements. And that a major issue with that was the planting of street trees in the state right of way. There are a lot of developments, as Dave was alluding to, in portions of Charlotte that are built. Houses are built, they're sold, people live in there. And the state won't take the streets because the city required street trees to be installed. So Warren, regarding that I think that's may have been what you were talking about, but Laura, this is where we're circling back around to that. We'll get to it later about the ETJ. Well, maybe during these 3 meetings, since it's all about roads and sidewalks and infrastructure, we can have some specific conversations about what the staff's thinking is towards resolving those conflicts. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can jump in and tell you what we're doing and what we're working towards as we're trying to develop concepts and language for the UDO is recognizing when we're in the ETJ and where we have those barriers and providing the flexibility in the ordinance so that if you are developing on a local street in the ETJ, in the tree regulations, you are allowed an alternative location for your trees so that we don't hit that issue. So I think right now our regulations are pretty silent on that. And we're trying to be really explicit in the UDO and acknowledge that out front and be able to address the issue.
And Walter, from a review perspective, staff, since we've recognized the issue with NCDOT, whenever we have a subdivision in the ETJ, we move the trees to the yards and out of the planting strip to make sure that those subdivisions are eligible for maintenance.
Is there any way, while we're going about this process, that we can create some sort of exception, some sort of grandfathering, some sort of something for those people who have already complied as they were instructed and still, can't get the state to take the streets over? If it's only the trees, then that's great. If it's water lines and sewers, like Nate was alluding to, it may be more than I can understand. But can we fix the disconnect that has been occurring for decades, so that when we get the new UDO document assembled, something in there addresses those circumstances where somebody's stuck with, city standards on state roads? Thank you.
Thank you, Walter.
Can I say something about that? It's Tony.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I think it depends on whether you look at it retrospectively or prospectively. Prospectively, I think it's easier to work with the standards so that they can match up with DOTs or NCDOTs if the ultimate intent is for the roads and the streets, et cetera, to become part of the NCDOT system, it's retrospectively that's a problem. And I'm sort of scratching my head about what can be done retrospectively to, I mean, we can't change with our UDO, the NCDOT standards. You know, I suppose that if there is a street that remains in the jurisdiction of the UDO, that perhaps there could be a provision to allow for alteration in order to comply with NCDOT standards and not fall out of compliance with the UDO standards. But I just wanted to make that observation. It's a bit in the weeds for the scope of this call, but it's something that should be on the radar screen.
Yeah, Tony, you're exactly right. There's been multiple discussions with NCDOT about how to resolve the issue, but we aren't in a place where we can make the state retroactively accept roads that have trees where they don't want them. We are in a place where we can say, well, you'll continue to meet the standards if the trees are removed, but
there's only a couple, but I'll get there.
You know, we don't have much control or any control over NCDOT and those standards.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Josh. And my apologies for any background that you may have heard as Alan and I were communicating. I want to go back just a little bit in the chat box and say to both Teresa and I believe it was Brent, you had kind of asked a question about really an appetite for the city to take over all roads. And Teresa, I think you hit it on the head a little bit. I think it's getting a little beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but I just want to acknowledge and let you know that I hear you and I hear Brent as well. So if we could maybe take that and we can get back to you offline about that. With regard to Cheryl, I think you've also got a question. And I'll go ahead and say, so Cheryl's question is, will or how will the UDO process regarding street design consider higher level urban design relationship between how all types of streets should support the type of current and future development, specifically relating to accommodating a variety of modes and how uses and design of buildings are supported? So who can help tackle that with me? Street design in the urban context.
Sorry, I had to unmute there. Sorry about that. Obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but what we're trying to do with the street designs and the cross sections that we're putting on the streets map, and again, we're going to talk. I think this is something we're going to talk more about in some of the coming sessions about kind of the relationship. If you look at, and I'll ask Laura to kind of backfill on this one as well. If you look at the work that's been done thus far in the UDO on the zoning, there is a relationship between the buildings, the frontages, and the street types, and how that's laid out in terms of the requirements and kind of the relationship between the urban design and the buildings themselves and the density. The street design itself, the cross section that would show on the streets map when that is adopted should reflect the context, not only the current context, but looking ahead to the future context of what that street is likely to be like. Based on the places and the other growth dynamics and the context moving forward. So they're intended to complement one another. They're intended to create that kind of building front to building front complementarity to actually support urban environments versus other types of environments.
Laura, did you want to, I was going to say backfill on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and from the zoning perspective, which is really controlling the building placement and I want to say design because people always think that means we're talking about brick or stone, but some of the key elements, the transparency on the ground floor treatment, things like that, entrances, spacing of entrances, much of that is tied to your frontage type, and frontages mean what your building is fronting on. So if you're fronting on a certain type of building, fronting on a local residential street, say your residential building, you'll have somewhat different requirements than if you're fronting on a four-lane avenue, kind of your basic city street, thoroughfare type street, and very different if you're fronting on a boulevard, which is a much bigger and higher speed, more vehicular oriented street. So basically we've tried to calibrate, CDOT will be calibrating the streets map to the place types, the type of area we want. And then on the zoning end, we'll be calibrating the design and placement of buildings, design at a high level with the type of street that you're abutting. So hopefully at the end of this, we will have, I think much like we've tried to do in TOD zoning, particularly for our more urban situations, we'll have much better integration of those different components.
Great. Thanks, Laura and Tracy, for that information. And thank you, Cheryl, for the question. I want to acknowledge a couple of folks' comments. Toby and Michelle, I very much see your agreement with Nate's question with regard to the water issue. Thank you for those contributions. Warren, I see that you've found that background information and provided a link in the chat box. I appreciate that. Eric, I see your comments. Thank you for those follow-up comments as well. I think everybody that largely catches us up in the comments and questions in the chat box. Before we pivot a little bit and start to go through some of the concepts for two of our SSI articles, I'll give one last opportunity, although we will have another break at the end of this coming section. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to speak about at this time? Okay, great. With that, we'll go ahead and we'll kind of get started in the second part of today's presentation, where we dive a little bit into the concepts about the subdivision streets and infrastructure section of the Unified Development Ordinance. And so as we have tried to wrap our minds around this and working on this as we have been, as other pieces have been presented to you, this kind of presents a little bit of our layout of our thinking. We're thinking about bringing to you concepts for the subdivision streets and infrastructure section broken out into 6 separate articles. Introduction to SSI is the first article we're thinking about. And again, we're going to touch base on that in here just a minute. We're also going to touch base today on a subdivision article for which our subdivision administrator, Josh Weaver, will walk us through some of the concepts for that article. And then we really kind of start to get into the meat and potatoes of SSI and the things that will start to, concepts for things that we'll start to bring you in the coming meetings. And those are network and access requirements, transportation improvement requirements, standards for streets, off-street public paths and cross-access, and then the other infrastructure that I kind of alluded to earlier. Next slide, please. And so we'll start today because it's a very kind of high-level article conceptually for the subdivision, streets, and infrastructure, and it kind of follows the framework that many of the UDO sections will. And our introduction article is going to establish a purpose, primarily to protect and promote public health, safety, and welfare. We're seeking to coordinate existing and future streets and infrastructure to ensure appropriate distribution, including options for additional transportation choices, and trying to provide safe and efficient access to land uses, with a concentration on some transit, pedestrian, and bike facility pieces. Again, I think all of us that even have a passing familiarity with rezoning, we always hear about the issue of our network. And so we want to try to create and improve upon a network of well-connected streets as well as transit services, really trying to set securing rights of way or easements to achieve complete streets and other infrastructure. And then really also trying to promote orderly growth throughout the city's sphere through the division or consolidation of lots for development. Next slide. And continuing, you'll see here in the same introduction article, we speak a little bit about applicability and administration. And we've already kind of had a good amount of conversation about applicability during today's meeting. And just again, to put it out there that, the SSI piece is going to apply really in the city sphere, and that includes the city proper as well as its ETJ or extraterritorial jurisdiction. And then we've heard a lot recently also about sometimes there being conflict between the city standards and standards that NCDOT has. And so conceptually, we're thinking about some language that says that, for development abutting an NCDOT controlled street, the city's SSI standards would apply unless they're superseded or prohibited by NCDOT standards. But an important caveat to this, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, is that there's oftentimes that, Division 10 city staff and NCDOT staff will work together to try to mitigate that conflict and reach a mutually agreed upon resolution. Now, with regard to administration, if you've got any familiarity with our current subdivision ordinance, you'll know that appeals and variances really are kind of heard by the Planning Commission and not what some may think is the Board of Adjustment. And then additionally, that the current subdivision ordinance has a development review board. And so as we go forward looking at kind of these interesting pieces of the current subdivision ordinance, we're trying to make it so that appeals and variances align with like many of the other pieces of the Unified Development Ordinance. And, those processes will be taken from the Planning Commission and go through whatever hearing body, whether that's just the Board of Adjustment or a Super Board of Adjustment or whatever that body is termed, it'll fall in line with the administration of other pieces of the UDO. And then secondly, the Development Review Board would no longer apply to anything with regard to the subdivision ordinance. So that kind of gives you a very brief high-level overview of some of the concepts that we're looking at and exploring for our Introduction to SSI article. And with that, I'd like to again introduce, I think I've already mentioned his name, and he's been kind enough to contribute to many of the comments and the questions in the chat box. I'd like to hand off the presentation to Josh Weaver, who is the city's subdivision administrator. So Josh.
Good afternoon. I'm Josh Weaver. I'm the subdivision administrator here in Charlotte, and I manage the group of subdivision folks that we are part of the planning department, but we sit in the Charlotte Development Center on the first floor. As Kevin said earlier, we review and approve in some form or fashion every map of property that gets recorded in the city of Charlotte. So we see things from moving a property line slightly to multifamily development that includes new streets to new single family subdivisions anywhere in Charlotte's jurisdiction. And as we talk about this is the process that comes out of the current subdivision ordinance, and it's tweaked here and there, but it's not necessarily changed significantly. It's a process that we use day in and day out to review and approve new subdivisions currently, and it works pretty well. It's an administrative process that staff take in the projects that are proposed, and then we review it along with all of our other partners in the development center and issue approval or provide comments before we can issue approval. In order to do that, we look at kind of two doors, and that's, are you a subdivision or are you not a subdivision? And are you a subdivision is defined by state statute. It's a subdivision. It's this lengthy definition here, but it basically says if you divide land or you put more than one building on a piece of property, that you're a subdivision, except that there's lots of gray. There's 12 exemptions that could be, I'm dividing property that's less than 2 acres into no more than 3 lots, or I'm subdividing property for an estate. There's kind of all shades of gray. Could you go to the next slide, Alan? So if you're exempt from the subdivision ordinance, sometimes it's really as easy as your surveyor drawing up a map showing that your lots meet the property, the zoning requirements, and staff review that map, make sure it meets the review officer criteria, and then it can be recorded at the Register of Deeds. That's kind of I'm not a subdivision door. Now, if you are a subdivision, there's different criteria that staff need to look at in order to meet the subdivision ordinance, but move on to the next slide, Alan. So if you're subject, if you meet the definition of the subdivision ordinance, you can either be a minor subdivision or a major subdivision. Minor subdivisions are smaller subdivisions. They don't include new streets. They could require curb, gutter, and sidewalk to be installed along the street if they don't exist. But they don't include things like drainage easements or new streets. They're relatively small in nature. And those are, because they're small, they don't normally include construction documents. They don't have plans that need to be reviewed. The only time we would have plans is if curb and gutter is required, and we need to make sure that those improvements are installed so that they meet city standards. On the other spectrum, if you're a major subdivision, you're kind of what you expect in your head is a subdivision. That's new streets, single family lots, or a multifamily project with new streets. It's involved, and staff do a lot of review. So we're going to go through a process, or help you understand the process of what a major subdivision involves. Next slide, Alan. So if you're a major subdivision, it starts with a sketch plan, and then it moves forward into preliminary plan or full construction documents for that subdivision. Once those construction documents are approved, we can issue a grading permit to allow for the construction to begin, and then it moves on into building homes. Next. So this portion is where staff work with designers, and the designer submits a sketch to make sure that the overall concept of the subdivision meets both the subdivision ordinance criteria for streets and the zoning ordinance criteria for lots and structures or multifamily projects. Once the sketch comments are provided to the developer and designer, then they submit a preliminary plan that's full construction documents for that subdivision, and it's reviewed, and comments are provided by both subdivision staff and our staff that was formerly engineering. Now it's stormwater, Charlotte Water, our Department of Transportation, and urban forestry, all kinds of city staff to make sure that those plans are compliant with all of the city criteria. Next. So those plans often go through multiple reviews. We try to have plans reviewed and approved within 2.5 reviews. And once they're approved, then the developer can go out and start grading. Next. So after the preliminary plan is approved and construction is started, normally the roads are, if it's a single family subdivision, the developer goes out and starts doing infrastructure work. The roads are installed and along with drainage and those basic things. And then the final plat is submitted through Excella, and that Excella is our electronic tracking program that allows staff to keep up with our processes. And all of our preliminary plans and plats are reviewed electronically through Excella. Once a plat is submitted and we make sure that it matches what was approved in the preliminary plan, then if it's in the case of single family or anything with a new street, a bond is posted for any improvements that's not done. And then the map can be recorded. And at that point, homes can be constructed on those new lots. Next up, our next slide. So I guess that's the end. And do we have any questions?
Thanks for that, Josh. We did have one come through that I think you kind of handled in real time. Walter was asking just for some clarity, do the preliminary plats go straight to planning or are they submitted through Excella? And I think, and just to reiterate and to be clear, I think you said that all of the plan reviews go through and are submitted to Excella.
Yes, they're submitted through Excella to planning electronically, Walter.
Thanks for the clarity, Josh. Yeah, so that was the only thing that came in through the chat box. Thank you, everybody. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to raise their hand and ask or comment on? Yes, Walter.
I asked that question because I was a little confused. The slide said it's submitted to planning, which is why I asked the question. But I've also encountered a situation recently with someone who has told me and asked me to look into it, why their plans are not being allowed to be submitted to Excella by a member of the staff about some change that somebody wants. And it's keeping the whole thing, the other 99% of the plan, from being reviewed. And it's been 2 or 3 weeks. And so if we can submit to Excella, who would be in a position to prevent that from happening? I mean, if you have a complete plan that meets all the standards and you do all that Excella magic stuff that you do, under what circumstances can someone say you're not allowed to submit your plan until you change something, even when it hasn't been reviewed yet?
So Josh,
Let me take that.
I was going to say, Josh, just 1 second. Respectfully, this seems like a very weedy question, Walter, regarding a specific project. If we could have Josh and you maybe coordinate offline about that, I think that'd work out best.
I don't mind that. That's why I asked the question about who do you submit it to, and I got
Yes,
the
sir.
answer, which is good, except that seems to not be the case. And I just didn't know if there were circumstances, but we can talk about it later.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? All right. As always, we very much appreciate everybody's participation. Just because we're winding down today doesn't mean that our continuing partnership stops. Feel free to reach out offline to any of the UDO team members about any of the questions, whether it be about this topic here today or about pieces maybe that we've covered in the past. With that, I'm going to kick it to Alan or Laura because I'm not quite sure, honestly, I thought I had seen Ty jump in, so I'm not sure who's picking up the closing.
Yeah, I think Ty would like to close.
Yes,
Okay.
I am. Thank you very much, Kevin. Excellent job. And appreciate everyone joining in. And I've been listening for the better part of an hour. So thank you very much for engaging. Once again, I want to thank Tony. Sorry I couldn't be here at the very beginning, but really good questions. I don't know if everyone saw the link that Warren posted with regards to the question that he had on the history. So if you didn't see that, you may want to go into the chat box and click on that. Very interesting information there. Well, thank you once again, everyone. I appreciate your definitely getting engaged. One thing that came up during the comprehensive plan presentation in the last couple of Mondays has to do with industrial use and how we make sure that we engage industrial developers in the conversation. So at the right time, I think this would be the right forum to do that. I know John Morris with Beacon will be very interested in that, but I also know there are others who will be very interested in what that conversation is like. So please be on the lookout for that. We'll definitely be coming back to you with that at the right time. Once again, thanks everyone. I appreciate you being here today. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
That was it. Okay.
Thank you. See you, everyone.